The summer Caleb Whitmore turned 15, he started burying trees. Not planting them, burying them. Every morning before first light touched the eastern hills of Colorado, Caleb walked behind his family's old red barn with a shovel in one hand and a bucket of young oak cuttings in the other. The branches didn't look alive, thin, gray, bare, the kind of thing you'd bundle up and burn, not press into the ground like it mattered. He dug a hole, set the cutting in, packed the soil around it, moved 10 feet and did it again. Day after day, hundreds of times. By the end of that summer, thin wooden sticks stretched in rows across the edge of the Whitmore family's 220 acres, and almost everyone who saw them came to the same conclusion. The boy had lost his mind. Thomas Whitmore had spent his whole life reading this land. Crops, cattle, weather, he knew what worked. When he looked at his son's rows of dead-looking sticks, he saw exactly one thing: wasted time. He found Caleb behind the barn one evening, hands black with soil, another 50 cuttings waiting beside him. "Caleb, what exactly are you doing?" "Planting a windbreak." Thomas looked around. No forest, no shade, just a field of sticks. "Son, those aren't trees." Caleb almost smiled. Not yet. His father didn't have an answer for that. Some things are hardest to understand before they've happened. The Whitmores had worked this ground outside a small eastern Colorado farm town since 1918. 4 generations who'd learned the same lesson passed hand to hand. Never fight the land, learn from it. But the land was getting harder to read. Summers ran longer, wind hit harder. The creek beside the pasture that used to run all year now dried up by late August, and the hills west of the property looked thinner every season. Fragile in a way people noticed and did nothing about, because surviving this year didn't leave much room to worry about 20 years from now. Caleb worried about it anyway. He'd always been the quiet one. His older brother Mason could fix anything with an engine. Hand him a tractor problem and a toolbox and he'd solve it by dinner. Caleb wasn't interested in machines. He noticed patterns instead, which fields the birds stopped nesting in, which patches of grass stayed green longest after rain, which way the deer moved when the seasons turned. His father called it wandering. His grandmother called it paying attention. She was the one who first told him the land remembered everything. When Caleb was 12, his grandmother Evelyn walked him out to the oldest, most neglected corner of the farm, rocky ground nobody bothered planting anymore. Hidden in the weeds stood a handful of oak trees older than the barn, maybe older than the house itself. Caleb put his hand on one of the trunks. Why are these still alive when everything around them struggles? Because they were given time. She let that sit, then went on. Trees weren't decoration. They slowed wind, held moisture, sheltered animals, held the whole system together in ways a fence never could. Your great-grandfather planted some of these. Nobody wants to wait like that anymore. She tapped the bark. Everyone wants something that gives them something today. Very few people plant something that helps someone they'll never meet. That stuck with him longer than she probably expected it to. He spent the following months buried in old farming books and forgotten extension reports, reading about the tree lines that used to stand where fences stand now, living windbreaks holding soil in place before anyone had heard of erosion control. He became convinced the farm needed that again. There was just one problem. Trees take years, sometimes decades. Modern farming runs on seasons. Caleb was thinking in generations, and that made him look like a fool to everyone measuring in the same season they were standing in. The first summer nearly finished the whole idea before it started. Of the 300-plus cuttings he planted, fewer than half survived. Heat killed some, animals got the rest, some just never took. Mason watched him replace dead trees one afternoon. "Dad could just buy stronger fencing, you know." "I know." "Then why do this?" Caleb looked out at the open fields. "Fences break." Mason laughed. "Trees break too." "Yeah." Caleb turned the small cutting over in his hand. "But trees grow back." The second year was worse, a drought bad enough that older farmers were still talking about it years later. Soil cracked, grass browned. Neighbors abandoned their own tree lines, convinced the ground simply wasn't going to allow it. Caleb nearly quit too. One evening he sat beside his rows of dead-looking sticks and let himself wonder if his father had been right all along, if some things just couldn't be changed, and he was only a kid, chasing an idea that sounded better than it was. His grandmother sat down beside him, no speech, no reassurance. Anything worth growing spends more time looking dead than alive. He was back out at first light the next morning. By 18, people had stopped laughing. Not because they'd come around, but because they'd stopped paying attention. The sticks had quietly become young trees, small but alive, and Caleb kept expanding the lines. Along the western edge, near the creek, around the cattle fields. Almost invisibly, he was reshaping the land. Nobody knew what those trees were quietly getting ready for. Nobody could have known a disaster was still years off, one that would test every farm in the valley and turn what everyone called a waste of 15-year-olds' time into the only thing standing between the Whitmores and losing it all. By his early 20s, most people in the valley had forgotten about the strange project Caleb started as a teenager. Not because they understood it, because trees that grow slowly eventually just become the landscape, and people stop noticing the landscape. The sticks were young trees now, rows of oak and cottonwood tracing the edges of the Whitmore property. Nothing dramatic, no forest, no tourists, no line on the balance sheet that improved because of them. They just stood there, doing their quiet work, which had always been the entire point. Caleb had never planted them expecting a fast return. The most valuable things on a farm are usually the ones that take the longest to show it. Thomas started handing him bigger decisions around the place during those years, not because Caleb had proven anyone wrong, but because he'd proven something better. He paid attention. One morning, checking cattle fence, Thomas stopped at one of the tree lines and ran a hand along the bark. He didn't say anything for a while. "You okay?" Caleb asked. "I remember when these were just sticks." "So do I." Thomas looked out across the field. "I thought you were wasting your time." Caleb laughed. "You weren't the only one." "No?" A pause. "I was wrong, though." Thomas Whitmore didn't make speeches. He didn't need to. Coming from him, 4 words were the whole thing. The years after weren't easy on anyone farming that region. Rain came in the wrong amounts or not at all. Neighbors sold out or changed how they operated just to survive. The Whitmore place struggled too, but not the same way. Its fields held moisture longer. The wind didn't tear through with the same force. Cattle had somewhere to shelter when the weather turned hard. The trees were becoming exactly what Caleb had pictured as a boy, a partner that never asked for anything back. Nobody could have predicted what was coming. The summer Caleb turned 27 broke every pattern anyone in the county had a name for. Grass gone gold by June. The creek down to scattered pools between bare rock by July. Every farmer watching the sky each morning and getting nothing back. Humidity dropped, wind picked up, and everyone who'd lived there long enough knew exactly what that combination meant. The hills west of the valley, the same hills Caleb used to walk as a kid, the same ground where he first noticed the land changing, sat dry and waiting. The fire started on a Tuesday. Nobody's sure what set it. Lightning on the ridge, a spark off a passing vehicle. It didn't matter once the wind got hold of it. A patch of smoke became a wall of flame inside minutes, moving faster than the crews chasing it could plan for. By evening, whole families were loading trucks with whatever they could grab. Barns, fences, fields, years of work. All of it suddenly up for grabs to something that didn't negotiate. The fire's path ran straight through the Whitmore farm. Thomas stood by the house, watching smoke climb over the ridge, older now and slower, having outlasted storms and floods and droughts in his time on that land, but never anything that moved like this. Mason was hauling equipment clear of the barns. Caleb was walking a firefighter through the property layout, when the man stopped and looked west, toward the tree lines. "Those yours?" Caleb nodded. "How old?" "About 12 years." The firefighter looked back at the smoke, then at the trees. "Those might help us." Caleb didn't know if he believed that. He'd planted those trees for years. He'd waited on them for years. He had never once seen them tested like this. When the fire hit the edge of the property, something changed. The flames didn't stop. They slowed. Caleb's tree line was cutting the wind, and the ground beneath it, shaded, root-bound, moisture-held, wasn't burning the way the open field around it was. The fire kept coming, but it came differently. In a wildfire, the difference between losing everything and saving something isn't always a wall. Sometimes it's just time. Those trees bought minutes, then more minutes, enough for crews to reposition, enough to hold the barns, enough to keep the fire off the buildings that mattered most. The same trees the whole valley had once called useless were the reason the Whitmore farm was still standing when the smoke cleared. The valley looked different once the fire passed through. Some places were gone past saving. Fields that had been green weeks earlier were ash from fence to fence. Then people reached the Whitmore place. The trees were scarred. Some burned through entirely, but they were standing. And behind them, so was the farm. Walter Briggs came by 2 days later, 50 years farming nearby, and one of the men who'd spent over a decade calling Caleb's tree lines his little forest. He walked the burned edge slowly, running a hand along blackened bark, studying the churned ground beneath it. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For thinking something had no value, just because it didn't pay off today." Caleb didn't say anything. Sometimes the land makes the point better than you could. Something shifted in the valley after that. Farmers who'd ignored the whole idea for over a decade started planting their own lines, not to copy Caleb, but because they finally understood what the trees had actually been for. Not today, tomorrow. One farm started, then another, then a third. Nobody had even told about it, the way anything useful spreads on working land. Quietly, farm to farm, in the season after somebody gets burned badly enough to listen. A decade on, the valley didn't look like a forest. It looked like a place that had remembered something it once knew and let itself forget. Caleb never got famous for it, never wrote a book, never gave a talk. He just kept farming, planting, tending, watching, because the whole thing was never about being proven right. It was about respecting something older than he was. Years later, he walked back out to the very first row he'd planted at 15, back when the whole idea looked like a shovel and a bucket of dead sticks and nothing else. He smiled at it now, because that's the trick people miss every time. A seed looks like nothing, a stick looks like garbage, an idea looks foolish, right up until time proves what it was actually becoming the whole time. Farming has always run on patience, the willingness to prepare for what you can't control, to build something you may never get to see finished, to leave the ground better than you found it. Caleb Whitmore didn't plant those trees because he knew a fire was coming. He planted them because he understood something simpler. The best time to get ready for a disaster is long before anyone else believes it's possible. And the things people laugh at today are often enough, exactly what saves them tomorrow.